Welcome everybody to the 2015 Summer Benefit. It's wonderful to see a full tent and I seem to recognize everybody. So it's great to be among friends, colleagues, and supporters, especially to be here with Ken Burns, somebody I have admired deeply because I do believe that we humans define ourselves by the stories we tell, and especially the stories we tell about ourselves. And I think we are, as humans, in fact, our consciousness can be defined as our memories. But what is true of humans is also true of nations. And I think we define ourselves as a nation by the stories we tell about ourselves and what we remember about ourselves. Our memories really define our values, and they define the way we create a new nation as we go forward. Faulkner once said, the past is never dead. In fact, it's not even past. It's a requiem for a nun. And that reminds me so much of what Ken Burns does, because Ken Burns is our national storyteller. For almost 40 years, ever since he did David McCullough's The Bridge, about the Brooklyn Bridge, he has defined himself as the ultimate storyteller of who we are. And we defined ourselves by the stories that Ken has taught us. We're the nation that invented baseball and still loves it. We're the nation that invented jazz, and it still resonates with us. Over and over again, he has helped show what is at the core values of the American nation. He's a signature storyteller, somebody who invented a whole new genre, a genre not just of documentary, but of still photography, woven together with music, woven together with narrative and oral history. He's done it with the Brooklyn Bridge, his first major film, award-winning. Through the Shakers, Thomas Hart Benton, Empire of the Air, the people who invented radio. Baseball and jazz, as I said, Mark Twain, the Civil War, the Roosevelts, cancer, the national parks. And even though they're very specific, they all weave together into a great tapestry. He's now working on Jackie Robinson and on Vietnam. Mr. Ken Burns.
Wow. Cool. That is amazing. I got a lot of work to do. Yeah.
Before we start, Jessica and John Fullerton, Ken and Carol Edelman, our two co-chairs or chairs for tonight, and our gala. Thank you all both. Thank you, Fullerton. That's amazing. You know, one of the things that you're known for is called the Ken Burns effect. You can even get it on an Apple computer. And it allows you to pan over a photograph or whatever. In some ways, that's a compliment to you, but I think what you do is more than that when you take a photograph, right?
Well, I think what Steve Jobs, somebody you know a little bit about, was interested in was figuring out how to translate something we'd been working on for 35 years, which is how to wake up an old photograph. How to treat an old photograph not as some dusty and boring relic of the past, but to trust it that it represents a frozen moment that had a past and would have a future, that you could not only just look at that photograph, but hear it and see it. And you could take a feature filmmaker's template of a wide shot, a medium shot, a close-up, a tilt, a pan, a reveal, and animate that old photograph and give as close as possible a proximity of what's going on in the world. And that was the effect I wanted. I was trained by still photographers, not filmmakers. Jerome Liebling was the principal sort of mentor at Hampshire College in Amherst, Massachusetts in the early 70s, and was an extraordinary teacher. And he would say, go, see, do, be. And he understood. I came in sort of infatuated with feature films in Hollywood, and he rearranged my molecules, reminding me, I think quite correctly, that what is and what was, particularly for me, what was, as dramatic as anything the human imagination makes up. And that's was an important changing point for me, and using still photographs, which for me is the basic DNA of what I do, even when there's an abundance of footage, as you'll see in a little bit, that's what I've been trying for the last 40 years to perfect, or at least get better at telling those stories.
It's partly, it seems to me, a metaphor, too, for what a great historian can do, which is give you a panoramic sweep, as you might have from a very large photograph of this, Matthew Brady on the Civil War, and then you sweep in and you look right in the eyes of an individual. And as a storyteller, you move back and forth from the panoramic, and then you bring us really close to the individual. How do you weave that together, not just in the photographs, but in your narratives?
Well, I think what you're acknowledging, Walter, is something that's been going on for a long time, and in a dynamic of historiography, how we teach history, how we think about history, how we talk about history, that it's mainly been from the top down, that mainly history has been, for most people, a succession of presidential administrations punctuated by wars. And that's not a bad way to hang your hat on a skeleton. But what we also know is that top-down approach is only really effective when it's met by a bottom-up one. And so for us, the Civil War, the biggest event in American history, the most important event in American history, starts very simply with a guy named Wilmer McLean who lives in Manassas, and the first Battle of Bull Run is raging over his farmland, and a Union shell goes in his summer kitchen and explodes, and he says, I'm getting out of here. I'm going to move my family as far south and west as I can get. And he moves to a dusty little crossroads called Appomattox Courthouse. And it is, and 3.5 years later, Robert E. Lee surrenders to U.S. Grant, and Wilmer McLean could rightfully say, the war began in my front yard and ended in my front parlor. And all of us, I'd read about Wilmer McLean in dozens of books, but they always put him at the end. They would put him when the surrender took place, and they say, Wilmer McLean, interestingly enough, used to live in Manassas. And then you say, well, wait a second. It can be contained within the parentheses of this addenda as much as it is in other aspects that we would think more top-down, more panoramic, as you said.
Oh, that leads to a question, which is, how do you research these things? How did you find a guy like that?
So one of the things is that in my business, and filmmaking has to be a business. It's not just simply you and the typewriter and your own shoe leather and maybe an assistant. It is really a huge operation and requires a good deal of generalship. But quite traditionally, colleagues have had a specific and delineated research period followed by a specific and delineated writing period, at which point you have produced something that resembles a tablet coming down from Mount Sinai, which informs the shooting and the editing. Thanks, it's done. Yeah. We never stop researching. And the researching isn't done by a legion of researchers, it's done by us. Mm-hmm. We read the books, we talk about it, and the we is not royal, it is 4 or 5 people on any given production that is the writer, a co-producer, associate producer, and we're reading, we're going to the places, we're looking at the still photographs, we're finding the facts, we're writing them down, we're engaging scholars who are themselves are suggesting things, and it's a process that never ends. I mean, I'm going to leave here tomorrow and go back to Walpole, New Hampshire, where I've lived for 36 years, and dive back into a big series on the history of the Vietnam War. And we're going to be parsing minute cinematic aspects of it. Please open that up. 4 frames, that's 1/6 of a second. Please close it 4 frames. But also the way we've described the decent interval of Henry Kissinger's strategy on how we could sort of pull out of Vietnam is informed by this tape or that tape, and what the scholars think each of those tapes means and how we can present it, what sort of setup it needs. So this is a constant and never-ending battle. And we are proud to say corrigible to the end. I feel that this is something we have demonstrated again and again.
Well, keep going there. Tomorrow morning you're going to land in Walpole. You're going to go to the editing room. What are you going to do? Get a scene fixed?
So what we'll do is we will screen episode 6. So a week and a half ago, we worked on episodes 1 through 5. There are 10 episodes. We'll look at episode 6, which is the shortest episode, but feels the longest. It's called Things Fall Apart. It is almost entirely about the Tet Offensive. And it is, I've prided myself in the Civil War and in the Second World War of bringing battles alive, even with still photographs and paintings and sound effects and first-person commentary, complementing, I hope, a third-person narrator. Same with the Second World War. The footage is pretty direct. Nothing is like having the Tet Offensive, you know, as we like to say, in a cliched fashion about Vietnam, in our living rooms. It's really visceral right now because we got all the outs as well as what was shown. We think we were shown a lot of stuff. We weren't really. The horrible stuff we got in white papers that were seen not by as many people in the nightly news. So we've collated that over the last 7 or 8 years. And by the time this is broadcast, it will have been 10 full years that we've been working on it. Wow. So we want to get it right. And lots of other folks will skim into a subject, and as you know, you spend that amount of time on a book, you need to get it right. And there's so much, particularly with Vietnam, so much triangulation has to take place, not just in storytelling, the essence of how you merge that panoramic with that intimate, but it also has to be how you calibrate an ever-changing historical landscape where we're discovering new things. In Vietnam, for example, we have had unusual access to the country itself, its archives, and by extension to Chinese and Soviet archives. But we've also been able to get access to the people. So our sense of a monolithic them dissolves in the face of meeting a half dozen or a dozen Viet Cong soldiers who all think differently. A couple of them are straight out of Central Casting, talking about the glorious struggle and the imperialist dogs, but the rest are very complicated, admitting to atrocities.
How did you meet them?
So there is a wonderful Irishman named Tommy Vallely who helped sort of corral John McCain and John Kerry and Bob Kerry to help the normalization process. He was a corporal in the Marine Corps, saw some really terrible action, did some very heroic things, but it haunted him, as it did so many soldiers. He went back, made his peace with the land and the people, and has spent a long time, and has at Harvard helped tutor many of its current leaders, and gave us a kind of access that I don't think anyone else has ever had. And we even brought the Vietnamese ambassador up to Walpole to show footage, because as much as you like a scoop, you don't want anybody to get in trouble, to go in jail in a still repressive regime. And so we showed stuff of these old guys admitting things or commenting on it, and it's outside the parameters of party lines. And so I think there'll be moments. There are very few sort of set-piece battles as there are in the Civil War or the Second World War. Most of the action, contact, as the Americans called it, was ambush. And no real estate was taken, so there was something odd about this war to begin with. But we have, in many instances...
Sort of resonant to the present.
And it's completely resonant to the present, and I want to get to that kind of conversation in a second if I don't forget. You prompt me, is that we have moments where we have a Viet Cong and or a North Vietnamese soldier shooting at our South Vietnamese and American Marine or Army guy who are all talking about the same moment of fire. And that, I mean, we had that to an extent in the Civil War, where you had Johnny Reb's diary and Billy Yank's diary, and you maybe had the general's orders and the newspaper accounts, but you didn't have it in the visceral sense where the guy from the South Vietnamese Marines is pulling up his pant leg and saying, and then they shot and you're seeing the AK-47 wound, and then it went in here. All of a sudden, it's a different kind of war.
Well, to quote Faulkner again, who said, "No battle is ever won," right. He also said, "The past is never dead." You wanted to get back to the question of resonance.
Well, I think we've always safely put history. I agree with what you said about storytelling. This is the way, you know, none of us are getting out of this alive. And the way we distract ourselves is we tell ourselves stories, and they achieve a kind of immortality in the way we talk about ourselves, both at a very personal level, as you suggested, and also at national and global things. But we also think that history is something sort of safely to be toyed with, you know, as a kind of avocation. But, you know, we talk about cycles of history. I do not believe there are any cycles of history. We talk about George Santayana's famous thing, we're condemned to repeat what we don't remember. I think it's a beautiful phrase and makes no sense whatsoever. Ecclesiastes...
What's it, Washington you quote Mark Twain and then say he didn't say it.
Yeah.
That's my favorite of those.
That's, you know, he's often saying that things where he attribute to people stuff that he didn't say. But the Santayana phrase is right. Ecclesiastes says, what has been will be again, what has been done will be done again. There's nothing new under the sun. And what that says is that human nature never changes. It superimposes itself on the random chaos of events, which means you can apprehend, perceive patterns in history. And that makes it resonate with the past. The present resonate with the past, and that these become conversations by engaging the past, as you know as well as anyone in this room. You're speaking also about a vastly complicated present. And because we think the past is fixed, the present is sort of malleable, and the future is unknown, it's actually in some ways a little bit the opposite. The past remains malleable as new interpretations, new memories, false memories, other things arise. And so we're constantly trying to figure out what happened before so that we could we could triangulate more precisely where we are now. And so we hear in Vietnam the echoes of Snowden and Afghanistan and Iraq and so many other policy decisions that you were talking about yesterday. We see in the I was telling the Resnicks yesterday in our film that we made a few years ago, where it was about 4 themes. One was single-issue political campaigns that metastasize with horrible unintended consequences. The demonization of recent immigrant groups to the United States, smear campaigns during presidential election cycles, and a whole group of people who felt like they'd lost control of their country and wanted to take it back. Those are only 4 of the many themes in Prohibition that resonate and make you think, wait a second, we're talking about now. Yes, but this is true. I mean, the Civil War was the first modern war, the imperial presidency that we talk about today, weapons at a level of mass destruction we don't anticipate. All our discussions are not new. Harry Truman said the only thing that's really new is the history you don't know. And I'll go by his guide.
You know, as long as we're doing our favorite quotes, one of mine is from Thornton Wilder's Skin of Our Teeth, with a fortune teller, and everybody says, oh my God, you can tell the future. And she says, yes, I can tell the future, that's easy. Telling the past is difficult. It is always changing. And you talked about the past being malleable.
And I think the obvious things are, of course, new information. You know, we made our film on Thomas Jefferson, you saw it there, and that predated the discovery that the DNA evidence more than conclusively proves that the Hemmingses are in fact related. This was the slave that he had. But our film had, you know, someone arguing most vociferously, Joe Ellis, as a matter of fact, that he couldn't have possibly slept with his slave, and a descendant of the Hemmingses saying, oh, absolutely, he did. And John Hope Franklin, may he rest in peace, saying it doesn't matter, you know, implying that our fascination with the sex between them is a late 20th century, early 21st century mindless tabloid mentality, that in fact he owned her. And there was not a single law in America that protected her. And so, you know, where's Sally, Mr. President? Oh, I killed her. She displeased me. And you can say, oh, well, Jefferson wouldn't have done that. His cousins murdered one of his own slaves for breaking a teacup that belonged to their mother. And there was not a law that protected her. And so we sometimes permit the prurient to sort of trump the larger issues that have constantly bedeviled American history, which is why we need to have a past. We need to sort of ask ourselves, who are we, and by extension, who am I, and delve into this very, very complicated past that doesn't offer very simple bromides, either about exceptionalism or about anything that's going on right now. And everything that's going on right now has its antecedents in all of these films that may seem safely dead.
But your most resonant theme, I think, is the theme of race. And it's through everything you do. Explain that.
Well, you don't go looking for it. I think that...
Even baseball.
You know, it's everywhere. Of course, the most important moment in baseball is April 15th, 1947, when Jack Roosevelt Robinson, the grandson of a slave, made his way to first base at Ebbets Field. You know, he had already refused to give up his seat 11 years before Rosa Parks. Martin Luther King was a junior in high school. The military hadn't been integrated. Brown versus Board of Education hadn't happened. There hadn't been a lunch counter sit-in. So this is the first progress in civil rights since the Civil War. Yes, it's about race. But you don't go looking for that. It's there. When Thomas Jefferson articulated our creed, you know, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, he owned other people. And and didn't free them, didn't see the contradiction or the hypocrisy, and never freed them, and so set in motion this American narrative that's always there. You don't go looking for, I have a few films, Horatius Drive, The Dust Bowl, Frank Lloyd Wright. Race is not a factor, but in every other one, it's a significant factor. It's certainly in Vietnam, it is in country music, believe it or not. It will be, you know, a huge part of any DVD that you pick up of ours and look at. And that's because there we were, born under this sign, articulating. He distilled a century of Enlightenment thinking, and yet there's a big oops. 75 years ago, we're murdering each other. 750,000 Americans died trying to settle an issue of slavery, which kind of got settled, but the resonances in the went on there that are now in the Jackie Robinson film about integrating swimming pools, about being stopped driving while black, and police officers and young black men, about, you know, integrating things, about white violence. All of these sorts of things continually persist. I mean, we're a year out from Ferguson, and it's still a dominant, resonant thing in America. And if we don't deal with it, which made Charleston so fantastic, it is actually, people just started to deal with it. I don't know how long that goes on and how quickly people go back to normal, but, you know, we remove offensive flags.
Did you consciously think about my work will deal with race?
No. I know that it's been a part of my I mean, I've not been formally trained in history. The last time I took a course in American history was 11th grade, you know, where they put a gun to your head and make you take it. But I was always really aware of what was going on. I really loved history. I was conscious as I was growing up. My mother was dying of cancer, and I remember sort of transferring the anxiety about that very interpersonal moment with what was going on the TV sets, which were the dogs and the fire hoses in Selma and all the other things, and getting very mixed up as a young boy of 9, 10, and 11 with what was the cancer that was killing my family and the cancer that was killing my country. And so I think that I've brought with it a very internalized version of that, but there's never been a sense, oh, this will permit us to do that. It's just, if you put your arms around jazz, obviously, you're going to touch race. But you can't not touch it in the Second World War. My dear friend Ken Edelman was telling me today about an interview he did with an African-American soldier who was bringing Italian prisoners back to the United States and going through Union Station in St. Louis, and he couldn't eat in the restaurant in Union Station in St. Louis in uniform. The Italians could. The fascists could. And that's still here. It's still going on. So I think engaging the questions at a level, and what happens is that we tend to say, oh, you're right, this is an important subject, and then accidentally segregate the subject by treating it separately. Oh, let's just do black soldiers in America or in the Second World War. But you want to take African American history, which is relegated to February, our shortest and coldest month, and see it not as a politically correct addendum to our national narrative, but at the burning heart of it. That it is a huge, huge propellant for who we are, good and bad. And let's emphasize that there is, as much as it has bedeviled us, we have made more progress than any other country. As much as it has sort of delivered us so much sorrow from the very beginning, from 1619, before the Pilgrims, that it has nonetheless enriched our lives. And all I have to say is 2 words to you: Louis Armstrong, you know, and you know what I mean. Yeah, I mean, what would we do without Louis Armstrong?
Tell me about the role of place in what you do, because that's the other theme that you can see in all of your work.
Well, you know, let me back up. I was interviewing the novelist Russell Banks, who must have come to this remarkable conclave here. And I was talking about Huck Finn and our film about Mark Twain, and he said that Huck Finn was our Iliad and our Odyssey. And even though most of the audience for Huck Finn still shared European traditions with the man or men who wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey, that we needed new ones because we Americans were grappling with 2 things that Twain alone among his contemporary artists, was willing to grapple, and those 2 things were race, which we've been talking about, and space, not outer, but the physical geography of this country, its bigness, the fact that we permitted, by liberating its people to decide for themselves the kind of government they had, liberated them in a mobile way. And so we're always reaching out and tactilely touching what every corner of this country is. And that's a huge ingredient of understanding American experience in every way, shape, or form. And I don't know a film that doesn't have a kind of expansive, loving relationship with landscape.
And every one of your films has sort of specific moments, like you talked about the Jackie Robinson moment when he gets to first base. I think in Twain, there's this wonderful moment when Huck has the letter.
Yeah, it's to me one of the great moments in all of American literature, as if not the greatest. It is, Ernest Hemingway, the subject of someone we're in the process of getting to know, said all American literature begins with Mark Twain, by which he meant begins with the adventures of Huckleberry Finn. And everyone knows the story, probably everyone in this room has read it, but the novel comes to a kind of moral climax when Huck, who is running away from a bad family situation, and Jim, a slave, is running away from slavery. Huck realizes that he has been taught all his life that harboring a slave or helping a slave escape is the worst thing you could do, that you would go to hell. This is eternal damnation for having done this. And he realizes that there are trackers out on the river that are coming within range, and that he needs to save his soul by sitting down and writing a letter telling them where the object of their search is. And so he begins to do this, but then as he writes it out, he stops and he begins to remember that how Jim would sometimes sit watch and let him sleep, and that how he'd all call him honey and such like things, and how he loved his family the way we love our'n. And this is written, Tom Sawyer was narrated by Mark Twain. Huck Finn is narrated by Huck Finn. And so he is embodying, written after the failure of Reconstruction, but about before the Civil War, and he writes this magnificent moment, and there Huck is caught betwixt two things, and I knowed I have to make a decision. And he looks at the letter, and he looks at the sleeping Jim, and he rips up the letter. And he says, I guess I'll go to hell then. And I mean, this is the beginning of our conscience as a country. It's an amazing moment in literature, but also for us now to relive it and begin to understand the kind of gestures and the kind of love that is required to sort of escape the specific gravity of all of these things that have tied us down.
I'm being selfish. You have 700 fans here, and I'm going to open it up because they're all leaning forward. And so I'd like to open it up to questions, but I think I'm going to start by calling on Bill Maher, because you said something a few minutes ago about your Vietnam piece and how it was amazing to talk to American soldiers in Vietnam, but then also talk to the Vietnamese who had been shooting at them. I worked on an Aspen Institute project with Bill Maher, who was our chairman, on the Agent Orange dioxin issue. And we went back to Vietnam, and our interlocutor on the Vietnamese side was somebody who was shooting at American planes as they were coming in. I'll leave it to Bill from there.
We had a chance to chat a little bit yesterday.
Keep it, don't touch it, they'll go on, yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
there you go. And I, like a lot of people in the audience, served during that period in the Air Force. We were flying cargo planes from Delaware with cargo to Vietnam and bringing back roughly 200 dead American soldiers each trip. And they didn't look like the coffin that was up there. They were in a body bag and they were crated. And we never wanted to look at the manifesto. And you're right, we never wanted to talk about it when we got back. And when I went back with Walter, it was pretty emotional. And the question is, you said that this is a little different than some of the other wars. Could you help us out a little bit, because we still need help?
Yeah, we do. Thank you so much. We will see those body bags. We will see those simple pine and metal coffins without the ceremony that the footage of Westmoreland talking that you just saw in the unpacking of the war. I made a film on Civil War. It had a great ennobling purpose. It liberated 4 million Americans. It united the country. We made one on the Second World War, which ended fascism and militarism in the world and created a kind of peace, more or less, that has gone on. There's nothing redeemable in the story of Vietnam except in those individual stories, the bottom-up stories. We have no famous people in this. They're on the newsreels. You can hear them on the tapes. We don't interview stuff. You'll recognize Neil Neil Sheehan, and you saw Max Cleland, who was a one-term senator from Georgia, who's a triple amputee. You'll see John Negroponte, that only my friend Nick Burns will probably recognize as a career Foreign Service guy who spoke a little bit of Vietnam and was sort of watching the betrayal of the South Vietnamese government from very, very up close. But everybody else is just a grunt. We've got nurses and doctors and POWs that aren't John McCain, and we have pilots and helicopter pilots and draft dodgers and protesters and deserters and Gold Star mothers and sisters and families, and that's the way we tell it. And what you begin to understand is, I think Walter, so lovingly applying it to me, was really speaking about what you all do here in the incubation of ideas and love that takes place here, is that you find that the redemption comes in the transformation of those individual stories, and their interrelationship, the intertwining of those stories begins to offer some meaning, some sense of hope, of reconciliation. We have been debating, and the largest issue in our country is not race, but the issue of freedom. What is the nature of freedom? And in the biggest and broadest sense, it's the tension between an individual freedom and a collective one. And we've been arguing about that since the election of 1800, and even before that, within Washington's cabinet with Jefferson and Hamilton. And that's been a good thing, and for most of the national elections in our country, we've been saying, my version of government is better than yours, and here's what I'm going to do. And more recently, since Vietnam, we've been arguing about government itself. The United States government is some pernicious, evil force in the world, when I would argue that for all its screw-ups, and this is 18 hours of it screwing up, there's been no greater force for good in the history of humankind in terms of its accomplishments over the long haul. Something to celebrate, but understand that it comes with a huge amount of undertow, a huge amount of riptide that will, if you succumb to it, pull you out to sea if you're going to just make love with exceptionalism all your life. And so I think for us, we've tried to balance that, and that in the combination of that, there can be something happen. Something metastasized in Vietnam. The arguments became more entrenched. The camaraderie that used to characterize the Congress, which we talk about in cliched fashions, about going out, yelling at each other and then going out to drink, that don't happen anymore. All of that stuff has its antecedents, I think, in Vietnam, and we hope that because so much of what we don't talk about it, that we don't know anything about it. And this film is, I was alive, I was, growing up, I was eligible for the draft, I had a high draft number. I mean, I live this, and almost everything I've learned is completely upside down. I give you a couple of things. Ho Chi Minh, marginalized figurehead from 1959. This is not a typo, I didn't say 69. The real man running Vietnam. Johnson heard his name mispronounced by, in a tape that we have, by McNamara, who had been talking to a British historian who just alluded to a hardliner on the Politburo. Not that he'd been running things for years and years, mind you, but mispronounced his name as Le Duan, L-E-D-U-A-N, Le Duan. He is the architect of the 64 offensive. He is the architect of Tet, not as the New York Times said, General Giap, pronounced Zop correctly, who died at 104 2 years ago. So Zop and Ho vehemently opposed Tet. Zop had his entire staff arrested and he was sent to Hungary. Ho had his secretary arrested and he was sent to Beijing. So all of a sudden, all the terra firma that we're on, and that's just two of a thousand things that we've learned in the course of opening up to the Vietnamese, hearing their points of view.
And you get these from the Vietnamese archives.
And the Vietnamese, but also American scholarship has now changed and has become incredibly rigorous. And our scholars, the 2 or 3 dozen people that are advisors, several are veterans from every branch of the service. We have, folks, cutting edge young historians from Dartmouth, also from the military college, from West Point, who we've used for dozens of years to get it right. The maps are right. So, this will represent not some bland averaging out of things, but in fact, putting our arms around the fact that this has diverse points of view, and maybe people who have opinions about Vietnam that are shaped as much about what their political opinions are now than what they actually know or even felt and believed at the time. It may be possible to relax those, and I've always felt, and I've said this among the folks who've helped us raise the money for what we do, that history's the table around which we can still have a civil discourse. Rachel Maddow and Bill O'Reilly love Abraham Lincoln sincerely. And that's a place to begin.
John, I think it's John Sarpa there. Yeah, and I'll catch you next. Yeah.
Thank you for your eloquence, it's unmatched. So compared to other countries or cultures, how are we Americans doing in learning from our past?
We're terrible. We're getting better, but we are still a relatively young country. And so we have exhibited over most of the last 50 years a kind of perhaps understandable arrogance that perceives like a late adolescence and immortality which we don't have. Vietnam was one of the reminders of immortality, and we've taken that and sort of grumpily gone into a kind of depression in which we haven't really investigated. But we are, as we grow older, I think Karl Marlantes is right. We've begun to ask, what happened? What happened? And we're willing to accept an answer that is nuanced and is not just one-dimensional. And in that is our salvation. Other countries have a kind of homogeneity that we don't have. It's sometimes superficially luxurious for them, but in the long run, rather stultifying. And we have a kind of heterogeneity that makes things unbelievably messy, but then possible of great leaps of understanding and compassion. And that's what I think we tell, going back to what Walter so eloquently said at the beginning, this is why we tell stories, is to somehow arrest. And, and I work in a different kind of medium than Walter, but we share the same sort of affinities for good words. Word is not the enemy of the picture in my business, as it is in so much of the movie business. And we have the largest classroom in the world. It's broadcast on public television. Our last big series on the Roosevelts reached 35 million people, and that was its first showing alone. Hyde Park would have to be open 304 years to get that number of visitors, and that's a very well-attended National Park Service site. So you begin to understand the kind of scale and obligation, therefore, that comes with the kind of stuff that we're doing, and it feels like a huge responsibility. It goes well beyond a conversation in a tent. It really becomes, what kind of people do we want to be? What kind of stories do we want to sell? Do we wish to completely lull ourselves to sleep with the old bromides, or are we willing to say that we are exceptional? And this is why, but. And we always have to include the but. Not in some revisionism, not in, as Donald Trump would suggest, political correctness, but within an idea that we are a complicated people. And when we tell complicated stories, I remember I was out on the hustings showing the Roosevelts film, and every single stop, someone would earnestly put up their hand and said, Franklin and Eleanor, they had a complicated marriage. And I'd say, complicated marriage is redundant.
Yes, ma'am. You don't have to, don't touch the mics. They'll do it back there.
Given the number of subjects in which you've produced films and the breadth of the subject area, I imagine you consider lots of possibilities. How do you decide what to move forward with and what to reject?
It's a really good question, and the flip and glib answer is that I don't pick them, they pick me. And in some ways, there's an element of truth in that. All of us we've been to college. If you went to a small college, you probably could tell by face everyone in your class. You maybe knew 2/3 of their names. You were friends or acquaintances with 75, 25 were friends, and 5 you'll know for the rest of your life. How does that happen? Accident, chemistry, whatever. So I think for us, it's something like the Roosevelts incubated for 25 years. Jeff Ward, who contracted polio when he was 6 years old, has written 2 magisterial biographies of the early life of Franklin Roosevelt, has been writing since Huey Long, advising since The Shakers. That was the second film you saw up there. Huey was the third film. And we've been talking about doing something on Franklin or all 3 of them, and nobody, James McGregor Burns, no relation, wrote a book called The 3 Roosevelts. But it's the first time people put them together. And I think we segregate them again in this myopic sense of what we know now, because TR was a Republican and Franklin was a Democrat, and therefore they couldn't be the same. They're exactly the same person in terms of policy. He's handing off his Progressive Party platform to the New Deal. TR is to FDR. So we wanted to do something interrelated, but it took a long time. Sometimes you just go, I was working in the editing room on the World War II film. It was like 2005 or 2006, and I was having a nightmare about the Battle of Peleliu, which is a horrible Pacific island. We didn't need to fight it. We could have left the Japanese garrison there alone, and they would have just atrophied of their own isolation. And instead, we went there, and it was a meat grinder on both sides. One soldier said it was like 2 scorpions in a bottle. It was horrible, and the footage is terrible, and I had a nightmare about it, and I woke up and said, we have to do Vietnam, we have to do Vietnam, and we began working on that, figuring out how we would do it, figuring out how you'd get them, who would fund it, all of those things, the exigencies of producing it. So most of all, it has to fit this thing. Who are we? We want to ask that question, sound it. And it comes in really small and very beautiful things like Horatio's Drive, which is a funny film about the first cross-country automobile trip. Americans love their cars and they like to be first at everything. So how come no one knew what the first automobile trip was? Nobody. It was mentions in these turgid books about the automobile. Nobody cared about it, and we suddenly unearthed all of this stuff. How do you choose Elizabeth Cady Stanton, to subject? So it's really just a sense that right now, that will give you that kind of access. And as you see, I'm rather greedy for that kind of stimulation and creation, and have got 5 or 6 films on, and those are just the mainline films. The others that we're doing, mentoring other folks and creating other projects, a justice initiative, a science initiative, that are keeping us really, really busy.
Yes, ma'am. Anybody over here? Okay.
This question comes from my 23-year-old son, who can't be here this evening because he's at Syracuse University doing his master's in history and documentary film.
Can I have a job? I know those questions.
In your films about pre-photographic periods, you have used reenactment to bring life to stories from the distant past. While your reenactment sequences are effective, in other films they can feel cheesy or contrived. In your opinion, what differentiates an effective reenactment sequence from an ineffective one?
That's a really sophisticated, and you have a smart son. It's the quantity. I do very, very minimal reenactments. I hate them. And what we try to do is do as much live cinematography. And then, for example, the Lewis and Clark film is 4 hours, and there's maybe 2.5 minutes of recreation, just sprinkled throughout. Because remember, you often, when you tell a story, have an objective viewpoint. But here we had to, since the country is no longer there that they saw, you have to see it through their eyes, so you have to understand subjectively who they is. And so we found there were in Iowa reenactors with the keelboats, and we met them one morning and just filmed them silhouette. And people who did dugout canoes and portaged it over the Great Falls in north central Montana, filmed them more or less silhouetted against the sky. Every once in a while we might come in very, very close for a dirty fingernail, filthy hand sewing leather with a needle, and to give that intimate as well as the panoramic to follow Walter. But the idea is that you just set that off. It's the vermouth in a very, very dry martini. And then the problem is laziness sets in for filmmakers, and then it's all reenactments. And then all of a sudden you go, isn't that guy wearing sneakers? Or, that is a fairly comfortable looking, proportioned person for a scrawny Confederate. Yeah. My feeling is if you want to do reenactments, that's called a feature film. And you need to just go to Hollywood and do that. And what we try to do is take, what I did with Thomas Jefferson was an interesting thing. The closest photographic, photography came into the United States in the early 1840s, well after Jefferson had died in 26. And so what I did is I took daguerreotype and early prototype cameras, and I went in to Monticello and I filmed every 3 or 4 feet, almost prefiguring by 20 years the Google car going through your street. street. And then what I did was a very crude version of what they do, is created a kind of still photograph of the interior of Monticello, which is about as close as it could get to Monticello. And so there's a couple of silhouetted reenactments there in the Jefferson film, but it's mostly taking license too with still photographs. So when Lewis and Clark meet the Shoshone Indians, finally after emerging out of the Bitterroot Mountains, or as they're approaching the Bitterroot Mountains, and they're going to show them the way over, we have a picture of the Shoshone Indians who didn't look much different in 1853 when the first photograph was taken of them. And we use that. And we're very mindful using contemporary paintings and etchings and drawings. But after a while, you do 2 or 3 drawings in a row, and it gets to be a cartoon. The photograph is still that thing that you have to have. And so we try to experiment. Sometimes you can just do it. We have, in Vietnam, since most of the film is about contact, we have to take license. There's not a camera crew on every ambush, so you're trying to take stuff. We have one extended sequence when a Marine is in this terrible ambush and is wounded, and it goes on for about 5 minutes, and I just said, look, you guys, the audience, don't like jump cuts. That's when you cut between a talking head, and it jumps like that. I said, but let's just keep the jump cuts in and put very modest sound effects and have no cutaways. Nothing, not even, and it is one of the most riveting scenes, and you don't need it. You just extend to him that moment, and that's what we try to do. Listen to people, see them on camera, and all sort of, tricks of the trade to try to get away from too much reenactment.
Yeah, in the back there was a woman with a hand up. I can't. Yeah, okay. You win.
Thank you for being here. What is the metaphor of or if it is metaphor, of the Vietnam movie with the film part of it going backwards?
Writers and filmmakers are loath to explain metaphors. They hope they... We were trying to unpack what happened. And we have a sense of what it is. The iconic image, perhaps, of the last one, motion picture, is pushing the helicopters off. Just the incredible sheer waste of the effort is epitomized as seen with me. And being a child of the 60s and growing up there, the great novel of Vietnam is actually a novel about World War II of that period called Slaughterhouse-Five by Kurt Vonnegut. His main character, Billy Pilgrim, is unstuck in time. He watches old World War II movies backwards. He sees them backwards. And very interestingly, planes, go back and land, and the bombs are sent back to the United States, and fittingly women disassemble them and send them into the mines where they're buried and never hurt anyone again. And I had been hugely influenced as a teenager by Slaughterhouse-Five and realized that kind of visual unpacking. So the last shot in that sequence is a French soldier moving through a rice paddy. You will see every one of those shots, some of them in the first episode, going forward, and leading you into it, the rest of the film. And so it's a way of saying, forget everything, erase the slate, stop, let's start. We'll start in 1858 when the French entered Indochina to take it over as a colony, and we will end today. And after that, you can put into place all your forward motion films and what you think, but we hope to, as I said earlier, rearrange your molecules a little bit, metaphorically.
Right. Let me go there, and then I'll try to get in the middle somehow or another. Yes. We got a couple more questions.
I know your dance card is filled through 1919, but two of the most compelling issues that we're dealing with now are what to do about ISIL and what to do with Iran. Can you envision making a documentary? And I wonder if you're already starting to do that now.
No, we're actually, the dance card's pretty much not sort of, if not definitely filled in, but we sort of have the contours of it through 2020, God and funding willing, of course. And I wouldn't do that yet. I need 20, 25, 30 years to be able to have the perspective, to be able to triangulate and call something history. Everything else, is the province of journalism in a way, and we're still deciphering that. Having said that, our earlier discussion about how present the past is helps us understand. I think watching the Vietnam series will be hugely instructive without us once ever pointing an arrow at Afghanistan or Iraq or the current situation to what's going on there. And I hope, too, that my description of the operative themes that transcend the dangerous gangsters and the sexy flappers of the Prohibition era are also hugely instructive about a political system that we think is so new and everything is so completely new and fresh today. And in one sense it is, absolutely. And in one sense it's as old as the campaign between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson in 1800. And so I would hope that in some ways, as I know I was not able to attend here, but the extraordinarily fascinating conversation that Walter was involved in and Nick was involved in yesterday is going to have to do for the time being until the books are read, until later the documentary filmmakers are going to come back and begin to kind of average out the various perspectives and weed out the biases, or at least try to take the thumbs off the scale where they seem obviously there and maybe come to some sense. I mean, I've got a lot of opinions, but they're just worth 2 cents.
Yeah.
I'm a big fan of yours, Walter's, McCullough's, all the big historians of our time. And I often wonder, especially in your documentaries, is your narration intended to be fair and balanced? Are you trying to take a position? I understand the interviews, and those people might take positions, might not, but do you? And who does the narration? I don't mean the reader, but I mean who writes it, and what's your intention there?
So you mean fair and balanced in the real words, the real meaning of the words. Yes, we strive wholeheartedly and with every effort to do that. And anyone who's been in our editing room will watch us sort of demystify, take an adjective or an adverb away, so as not to mistakenly project some view left, right, or center. It's just trying to describe what's happening. We do permit a whole variety of commentators to reflect their opinions, however myopic. We try not to make them wrong, that is to say, allow things that we know to be patently wrong to exist in the film. But we want to know, particularly in Vietnam, a range of experiences. And it is so fortunate that 3 of the presidents, 2 particularly, had tape machines going, which means we don't actually have to say anything. We just can roll the tapes, and no matter what they said in their memoirs, no matter what spin they put on it here, perhaps, there is the tape, and the tape really tells you what was happening at that moment. I've had 2 principal writers for most of what we've done. One is Jeffrey Ward, and the other is Dayton Duncan. They will do a first draft based on the materials, the sort of structures that I've imagined, and then I do an awful lot of rewriting in the editing room, or when I am the scratch narrator who's reading that, and every time we change an to a the, I have to go back and read not just that sentence, but the entire page of narration so it blends together. And so I get pretty familiar with this and help change written word into words that can be spoken, and then as we edit, do the in the trenches work that requires a good deal of rewriting. But you know, I've taken credit for it in the past, but the other producers are in the trenches as well, working on it. But essentially, those words have come from Jeff Ward and Dayton Duncan, but they have been vetted by, in the big series, in every case, almost 24, in the case of Vietnam, more than 24 advisors and consultants and academics who themselves have their own, you know, it's very interesting. We think of the academic academy as being sort of the pure form of history, and it's really not. Since the Second World War, the worst event in human history, narrative fell out of fashion, and the academy really struggled for understandable reasons, and they replaced it first with Freudian analysis and then Marxist or economic determinism. We've seen symbiotics and symbolism and postmodernism and queer studies and all sorts of different ways of skinning the cat, and what you find is that at the end of the day, telling a story and then, if it's done well, can contain all of those sort of multiple views of how to tell a story. story, and they can coexist. And I think I've spent my professional life trying to refine a voice that is, as you say, fair and balanced, but also is inclusive enough to have numerous ways of seeing the subject, of skinning the cat. And that's what I like nothing better than making a film better. And that's what I try to do every day.
Well, one of the great advantages of academic history, having abandoned narrative, is it allows some really great narrative storytellers, from David McCullough to Jeffrey Ward to yourself. I have one last question, which comes out of something you answered John Sarpa when he said, our own view of history, and compared to other nations. And you said other nations are more homogenous. We're very, different, diverse, heterogeneous, and that makes telling our story more difficult. In all of your films, are there one or two characteristics that are distinctly American, no matter what our background is?
Yes, I think in the end it comes down to improvisation. It's at the heart of who we are. We are trying to take, that heterogeneity makes it impossible for us to impose orthodoxy without a great deal of pushback. And so people are, in America, negotiating a complicated present. We have a constitution that is 4 pieces of paper, parchment, still the shortest constitution on earth, that is able to adjudicate some of the most complicated problems in the new 21st century. The only art form that we've created that is recognized around the world is about, at its heart, and you've had Winton here, improvisation. The people who invented it were in a community of people who had an experience of being unfree in a free land, which means, I can promise you, you have to improvise a hell of a lot more than the rest of us do in order to make it happen. We have a marketplace that is so rich and so filled with infinite possibilities. We have a game that we invented alone in the world that is a fairly simple set of rules that has infinite chess-like combinations in its day-to-day application. All of that bespeaks a kind of an American predisposition to all the attendant things that go with improvisation: hard work, unsatisfiedness. Remember, we always focus on what does happiness means. Is it about the acquisition of material stuff, or is it, as this place knows in its bones, a marketplace of ideas, lifelong learning, as what Thomas Jefferson and all the founding fathers met by happiness was lifelong learning. Where do we get that hard work, that unsatisfyingness? It's not even happiness, it's the pursuit. We're a nation becoming. A lot of other nations know what they are, and they're very certain about that. If you've ever met a Frenchman, you know what I'm talking about. We, as much as we can proclaim our exceptionalism, are very, very uncertain in a way, and actually participate and revel in a sense of possibility, that we are in the process of becoming, that we are in pursuit of happiness. And all of that bespeaks, falls back on the hard work, that sense of being unfinished, back to this idea of improvisation, of making it up, of reinvention.
Ken Burns, America's Storyteller. Thank you.